Remember, you can find all the episodes of this podcast at historyasithappens.com. You can download my conversation with Peter Bergen about Osama bin Laden, as well as our 3-part series on the post-9/11 world, among more than 70 episodes so far, featuring conversations with historians about war, politics, economics, and culture. historyasithappens.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now, History as It Happens, September 28th, 2021. America's longest war.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
50 years ago, Richard Nixon declared war on drugs, but despite its monumental failures, Congress, federal agencies, police departments, and prisons just can't say no to continuing America's longest war. Trillions of tax dollars spent, millions of people arrested, thousands of lives destroyed, in a failed effort to stop people from doing what they've always done: use and abuse narcotics. Is there a way out? That's next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
There's no moral middle ground. Indifference is not an option. We want you to help us create an outspoken intolerance for drug use.
This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs.
I just want to shake some sense into you kids that are using drugs and think about using. So remember, don't, or else.
About 15 years before Mr. T threatened to kick our asses, President Nixon announced a new approach to drug abuse. Of course, different drugs had been illegal at different times in history, such as alcohol in the 1930s. But after recreational drug use soared during the peace and love decade of the 60s, Nixon declared war.
I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive, dealing with the problems of sources of supply as well as Americans who may be stationed abroad, wherever they are in the world. It will be government-wide, pulling together the 9 different fragmented areas within the government in which this problem is now being handled. And it will be nationwide in terms of a new educational program that we trust will result as from the discussions that we have had.
A half-century later, let's assess some of the results. The federal government has spent more than $1 trillion on this criminalization effort, 3 times more than the cost of World War I, adjusted for inflation. Yet in the past quarter century alone, more than 700,000 Americans have died from overdoses, many involving opioid painkillers. These facts and figures can be found in the book Drugs and Thugs by Russell Crandall.
Disproportionately hitting minorities, African Americans. But it was the case, numerous members of the leadership of this very African American community, inner cities, who either felt the best thing we can do with crack dealers is to lock them up and throw away the key.
Crandall teaches Latin American studies at Davidson College. He once served as a White House national security aide to Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, among other impressive appointments. Our conversation is coming up in a moment. So one of the themes of this podcast is reassessing, right? Take our series on the post-9/11 world and foreign policy, rethinking 2 decades of failure. We've also done episodes on American capitalism and democracy, things we take for granted that maybe aren't working so well anymore. We use the lens of history to try to make sense of these issues. So it would seem that the war on drugs is also in need of a reassessment. At this important juncture in our country's history, when Americans are rethinking a lot of things. My first memory of the war on drugs was the Reagan era. I was born in 1975, so I was old enough to remember Nancy Reagan and her famous slogan.
I know it seems like such a simple message, just say no, but it's an important one.
The drug dealers need to know that we want them out of our schools, neighborhoods, and our lives. And the only way to do that is to take the customers away from the product. Say no to drugs and say yes to life.
Now, the Reagans were sincerely concerned about the horrible effects of drug abuse. But the nation's approach to that problem before, during, and since the 1980s has created enormous problems. Privately run prisons bursting with nonviolent drug offenders, cartels and narco states, violent crime, corruption, the list is long. The war on drugs has failed. So let's talk about how we got here with Russell Crandall. As mentioned, Davidson College scholar and author of Drugs and Thugs. He has a new book coming out soon, Our Hemisphere, the United States and Latin America from 1776 to the 21st century. Russell Crandall, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
So in your book, Drugs and Thugs, you start off with a confession of sorts, given your background in government. Tell us a little bit about that.
I think during my 20 years as an academic, I've had the privilege to spend about 4 of those in government service in the executive branch on the Western Hemisphere, Pentagon, and the National Security Council at the White House. And that has, by definition, put me right into the mechanisms of policymaking related to the drug war. And I think when I finished my last stint in 2011 with the Obama administration, I realized that I had played a part in this protracted drug war, yet I really didn't, and neither did most of my very smart, very dedicated public service colleagues, have a good sense of exactly what this war was, what its effects were, especially on the foreign policy side of the countries in question. So that came with my scholarly interest to turn it into the book. But very much, I think I have sinned in the policy making frame. And could this book be part of that understanding? I mean, we've thought a lot about Afghanistan in recent months, about this 20-year endless war, but really, when you compare it to the drug war, it still doesn't even rival it.
But you don't entirely dismiss the war on drugs as a complete failure.
Yes, and I'm very intentional about that because I think there are scathing and oftentimes I think very compelling, accurate criticism. It's had an awful lot of time to produce success. That remains elusive, but I think it's important, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You think of the case of Colombia, where the United States, driven initially overwhelmingly by the war on drugs, did come to that country's support at a very, very delicate, perilous time in its modern history, about 15 years ago. And so there are tactical elements, ways in which I think the quote unquote drug war has indeed had some successes.
Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs in 1971. That might be the modern context, but your book really starts in the early 1900s, right?
Yeah, I think so. And again, if you had asked me when I started working in policymaking, or even when I started writing this book, when did the war on drugs start? I would have said, with Nixon in the early 70s. But it's remarkable to see 7 decades prior in the early 1900s is really when we had our first crackdown. Before that time, just about anything from cannabis to opium to alcohol, cocaine could be purchased legally. From President Grant, Abraham Lincoln, Sigmund Freud, the list goes on and on and on, who either got addicted by these substances, who either sampled them or used them for anesthesia and then developed an addiction. There was rampant abuse, and it was not a perfect world by any stretch. And I think that is a reminder to those myriad and these days vocal critics of the drug war that somehow a laissez-faire approach, just let anybody take whatever you want, would somehow usher in a drug utopia.
In those days, alcohol and cocaine were medicine, or used as medicine.
Yes, and so was opium, of course, but also abused, of course. So
why don't we move on to prohibition, since we're starting in the early 1900s. Prohibition of alcohol was a disaster, may have reduced drunkenness and done away with the saloon culture in the United States, but I think most people look back on prohibition as a failure. However, your view is that prohibition is not a good analogy to our current dilemma. Why is that?
Well, I think as we often remember that this was a singular failure There were, in fact, you mentioned the saloon culture, but you also had markedly lower rates of liver disease. There were far fewer spouses who were abused during that time. And I think also alcohol is a different substance in terms of the way that it is accepted, at least today, culturally in places of the world. And so just because it could be that alcohol can find a place in our modern society doesn't necessarily mean that crystal meth or, take some of your hard drugs would equally.
But I think the lesson about prohibition is bans, prohibitions do not work. I agree that it's not a perfect analogy to what we're dealing with today. I think the issue with decriminalizing narcotics today is not that people will simply stop using them and they won't continue to pose serious social problems, right? It's that we won't throw people in prison anymore for drug abuse. We'll find other ways, mitigation, education, regulation, and maybe that's pie in the sky thinking.
No, I personally agree with you entirely. Is there a middle ground that has regulation, that has education? Even if you look at some of the statistics, cannabis legalization over the last half decade or so, you've got now billions and billions of dollars of revenue that's being taxed. But that's all, again, at the domestic level, not on the foreign side where the drug war is much more static. A la Miami Vice, the 1980s, a la Pablo Escobar. If your listeners have seen the series Narcos and kind of going back to that quote unquote halcyon days of the drug war and cocaine trafficking in Latin America in the 80s and 90s.
So let's go now to the start of the modern war on drugs, capital W, capital D. Richard Nixon makes the announcement in 1971.
If we're going to have a successful offensive, we need more money. Consequently, I'm asking the Congress for $155 million in new funds, which will bring the total amount this year in the budget for drug abuse, both in enforcement and treatment, to over $350 million.
What was behind that?
Yeah, a lot of people think he was declaring that this was, the beginning of the global war on drugs, just because of where all these drugs were being produced. Latin America, above all, coca, the raw material, and then processed into cocaine. But Nixon, initially, he was largely referring to growing domestic usage addiction. We had GIs coming back with heroin addiction from Vietnam. You have kind of the whole counterculture question of Timothy Leary and company and increased addiction usage in the inner cities. This is where, and I think it's important to reinforce that, as was the case under Reagan in the 80s, and I'm sure we'll talk about that shortly, Nixon was not concerned about how this would resonate politically. This was very much supported by the American public who said, okay, this was the entirely appropriate response given what drugs are doing to our domestic society right now.
And from the very beginning, this was viewed as a war. I think we get into trouble as a society when we declare war on things because it doesn't allow for too many flexible responses, right? It has to be destroyed, has to be eliminated. Was that a mistake right from the get-go in your view?
Absolutely. You got a great metaphor. He's a politician. So, and I think we'll see again the same thing with both Reagan and H.W. Bush. And then even for drug war proponents, they backed off that, calling it a war is counterproductive. So we have moved beyond that today.
John Ehrlichman, a Nixon aide, later on said that Nixon was really trying to criminalize black people and hippies, therefore making the war on drugs a racist and politically motivated crusade. Do you agree with that thesis?
Yeah. How do we corroborate that? Who's in the room? It wouldn't be out of character for Nixon to imagine something like that. But I think it is the case that even before Nixon, going back to, who were we busting for reefer in the 30s, 40s, and 50s? It was Mexican immigrants. It was African Americans in the South. This has been a racialized war on drugs.
It seems unlikely, though, that it was the only motivator for Nixon.
I agree. Something I talk about in the book, that yes, we've had this century-long war on drugs, and the capital W, as you described it, capital D war on drugs, since Nixon. But we've also really, since Nixon, had the war over the war on drugs.
So to start a war or to fight a war, you need an army. And in the early 1970s, an army had to be created. Talk a little bit about what went into the formation of the DEA and just how large this has gotten over the last several decades.
Yeah, I think something to keep in mind that, yes, the DEA and kind of that association with Nixon, but a lot of these outfits really started going during Prohibition, because when you had the repeal, suddenly booze is once again legal. Those agencies hatched out of Prohibition then also, in addition kind of to regulating alcohol, turned to the prosecution of heroin, of marijuana, all these drugs that had been illegal prior to Prohibition, but now were in the crosshairs of these new, including the FBI. In other words, if in the 1950s and 60s, you have DEA-like agencies that are going after heroin coming in the U.S. Think of the French Connection. If you've seen the movie, Gene Hackman.
I got a name for you. Cy Boca, Brooklyn.
Boca?
Yeah. B-O-C-A. What about his wife, Angie?
Doesn't register. There's been some talk.
About what?
Shipment. Coming in this week after. Everybody's gonna get well.
Well, who's bringing it?
But then, yes, there's a new institution or agency with the DEA. It started out small and has swollen. It does now almost have a self-justifying element and inertia to it.
We have these enormous bureaucracies now. At first, the DEA had a budget of just $75 million and 1,400 special agents. Now it is 5,000 agents, a $2 billion budget. So good luck getting rid of that, right?
Yes. The term I use in the book, I call it the military-industrial narcotics complex. And this is really where I am scathing of our policies. If you're in Colombia and working on counter-drug programs, you have contractors who maybe they're in the State Department who are now private contractors working on the aerial eradication of coca plantings. Maybe it's DynCorp or some other corporation who's got a cushy U.S. government contract. Maybe it's a contract from the Colombian government, but the Colombian government has gotten aid from Washington. This is a good lifestyle for those contractors. Simon Bolivar, the great Latin American independence leader, he lamented of Latin American unity post-independence, that it was like, plowing the seas. And sometimes I think like the drug war is like plowing the seas, because a decade ago, people were looking at Colombia. Okay, here we have some data that suggests that it's looking better of cocaine production in terms of reductions than prior. So we're going to call this a success and take this model and they did this to Afghanistan. Over the past, this is even before the Taliban took over, but the past decade or so in Afghanistan, and they applied it not to cocaine, but to poppy for that massive crop in Afghanistan. And it was an unmitigated disaster. There's more poppy being cultivated in Afghanistan than ever. 2 decades of U.S. counter-narcotics funding tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, and taking what we said was a world-beating success strategy of Colombia and applying it and just having this blow up in our face.
I know we're bouncing around a lot here. I want to return to the 1980s and Reagan, because I want our listeners to come away with a sense of how this grew over the decades. Reagan approached the drug war in some of the same ways that Nixon did, right? And he expanded it. Harsh criminal penalties, mandatory minimum prison sentences, right?
Yes. So I very much grew up as a kid of the 80s. And I remember being in high school and, the Just Say No commercials, the, most notorious one, this is your brain.
This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?
fry the egg. This is your brain on drugs.
Growing up with the notion that drug abuse is bad and you belong in prison if you do it.
Yes, and it's going to kill you. And it terrified me. And remember that before this point, cocaine use was probably peaked, late 70s, early, middle 80s. But before Reagan, there wasn't much of a stigma about it. That changed with Nancy Reagan. It's going to land you in prison. It's going to kill you. And also, this is where the way to get rid of the drugs is to go to the source. And that became kind of this quote unquote source country strategy. The oft-used expression was, well, if you want to get all the bees, you got to attack the nest. Sometimes those types of drug war expressions can drive policy in ways that you wouldn't imagine, but that's exactly what they did. And this was, I think, especially on the domestic front, where we went all in on criminalization, disproportionately hitting minorities, African Americans. But it was the case, numerous members of the leadership of this very African American community, inner cities, who either felt the best thing we can do with crack dealers is to, lock them up and throw away the key. So it was a frenzied era that, think of all of that hysteria about crack babies and all of, how addictive crack was. And now, we have a better sense of just our overreaction that led to some really devastating, counterproductive policies, laws, especially on the law enforcement side.
I was asked by a group of children what to do if they were offered drugs. And I answered, just say no. Soon after that, those children in Oakland formed a Just Say No club.
Where did Just Say No come from? Who came up with that idea?
I believe it was someone, there were all sorts of anti-drug organizations, and I believe that someone coined it in that realm, and then Nancy Reagan ran with it. But for all intents and purposes, it was her program.
I mean, it worked on me. I was raised Catholic, so I was raised to fear a lot of things, I suppose. But the problem with it just wasn't enough, right? What's your verdict on the Reagan-era approach to the drug war? Did it have any successes, or was it really the social catastrophe that so many people make it out to be?
We should be critical. And I think, yes, we got moralizing. It got caught up even more in the broader cultural war. And it was just wildly counterproductive.
And filled prisons with people.
Yeah. Yes.
I want to ask you about the difference between the way cocaine and crack were dealt with. Where did that come from, and what was the effect of that?
Well, you're thinking again, this was a crisis and people were dying. And so it became this disproportionate about if it's done in weight, get a much harsher sentence for crack than that same substance in the powder form. But at the time, again, you thought, well, this was, again, generally, if not overwhelmingly supported by these Black communities and Black leaders themselves, that the real scourge here wasn't the powder cocaine. The real scourge, the Satan here, was the rock.
But they were the same drugs.
Yes.
They were the same drugs. So how did we get to the point where one was dealt with more harshly than the other?
You think of the way that it's consumed and been treated, so it can having a different effect on you. What we thought, though, is that this was so lethal. It's not that, crack is good for you, but, we probably overestimated. I remember thinking, if you just take one toke of crack, you are addicted. So if that's what you believe, that's certainly what I believe from these breathless times. It made eminent sense to treat them differently than powder cocaine that's snorted and gets you amped up for your Friday night.
So it had a racial aspect to it.
Yes. But again, I think in my research, and I think this is part of the story, is that at the time, there weren't voices standing up and saying, okay, this is racist, but in fact, it's appropriate.
When I think of the war on drugs, I often think of the effects in our own country. Prisons filled with non-violent drug offenders, the crime, everything we've been talking about here, the politics. I often do not think of how the United States prosecutes the war overseas. You've already discussed Colombia and Afghanistan. These interventions, so to speak, were born from the idea that if you can destroy the drugs at the source, well, then there'll be less of them reaching the United States, the market in the United States, the demand for these drugs. Well, let's cut it off at the source. Has this worked?
No, writ large, it has not. I think it has been a categorical failure. And so often, I think I'll just give you one quick example. Coca. So again, that raw material was coming from Bolivia and Peru. Let's just say Bolivia. And then being processed in clandestine labs in Colombia before smuggled into via the Bahamas or the Pacific Ocean or through Central America and Mexico to the U.S. So the U.S. cracks down on that transfer of the raw leaf, or what they call the paste, basic material of the cocaine, cracks down on it going into Colombia. And so what you had then, you think, okay, that's a success. Now Bolivian coca leaves are not getting into Colombia. Okay, we've solved this. We got the beehive. Well, of course, we call this the balloon effect. Push down one place and it pops up the coca cultivation in Colombia soared. And so it was even closer to the actual clandestine processing labs. So now today, over 95% of the cocaine consumed in the U.S. is from Colombia. But there's also been a surge in cocaine being produced in Bolivia. But because former President Evo Morales, this very kind of anti-U.S. leftist, tossed out the DEA, entirely the Bolivian cocaine is going to Western Europe, it's going to Brazil, it's going to Argentina. But U.S. officials don't talk about it. Members of Congress don't howl about Bolivia becoming more narcotized, becoming a cocaine producer, because we're not involved. That gets a little bit back to the Afghan example, but
there's no accountability. No American military commanders have lost their jobs, as far as I know, from all the failure of the past 2 decades. I'm not sure that anyone's been held accountable for the failures of the drug war. However, there have been recent moves towards a more sane policy, and we've covered a lot of ground here, starting with Nixon, then Reagan. But in recent years, there has been a liberalization of marijuana laws in dozens of states. Have they been successful in your view?
Yes. Just the fact that it started with 2, with Washington State and Oregon, but we did have little laboratories, fascinating for social scientists, to see what would happen in terms of usage, abuse, tax revenues. This was something, even when I started researching the book 8-9 years ago, that would have seemed unimaginable, that now you would see dozens of states having either legalized medicinal or recreational use. Sometimes it was like the Cuban embargo. I tell friends that one thing is you can try out the drug wars, that we can end it. And then if it's so bad, we can always start it again. And I just can't imagine that if we follow on some of these ways, like what they're doing, decriminalization, a lot of this is very encouraging of what's coming from the federal system. We can now more fully imagine, at least on the home front, an altered landscape that just some years ago was inconceivable.
We've been talking about illegal drugs most of the time here, but the biggest drug problem today is brought to us by our pharmaceutical industry, the Sackler family, prescription painkillers. I guess I'm having trouble getting my mind wrapped around the dimensions of this problem, because I've only really learned about it recently, just how many people have died from overdoses and all the ripple effects of that. What a failure of our institutions, right?
It's staggering. 1 in 2 Americans know of someone addicted or has died from opioids. When I was even just putting the final touches on the book in 2016, 2017, I'd never heard of fentanyl. I learned about it or read about it with the death of Prince. And now it is central to our enduring epidemic. Kills more people each year than traffic accidents. It's a veritable war's worth of death. We can put it in comparison to COVID numbers. This is a not insignificant share of this problem came from the legalized pain medication market and those abuses and kind of leading to addictions, substituting with illegal substances, namely heroin, but now with so much of it being fentanyl. And it has shifted the demographic considerably. And so this is something from Chris Christie as a presidential candidate and others who have spoken very forcefully, very painfully about addiction in their families. We've come a long way from the crack baby approach of the 80s until now. And unfortunately, it's just taken all of this death and destruction. But I do think there's an element that's worth talking about. And that is, yes, we don't see these people as moral failures. We see this as addiction and disease and victimhood. But it's still, I think, even for people who are sort of more progressive on this, there's still the belief that, well, we should throw the book at the people dealing this stuff. If you are dealing heroin, if you are dealing oxy pills, if, mixed with fentanyl. And I think that's where our society is right now. That, again, we're not talking about the users. This is about the small-time dealers.
Last question for you. It's a big one. When is the war on drugs going to end?
You're the over-under, goodness, right? What century? You've got some blue sky with cannabis, with psychedelics. I wish our foreign drug war, wasn't going like it was circa 1987. But I really do think that people have to go after the purse strings. That if so much of what you see in the Pentagon, what you see at DEA, these are all organizations with budgets and mandates. And so if Congress says, okay, we are cutting off A, B, and C, you can't do, because again, you would never imagine that we would ever have our drug war today and we wouldn't be like fighting drugs and thugs in Bolivia. And that's the case, right? Think of Afghanistan, right? We've been doing drugs and thugs there for 20 years and now presto, and no one's concerned about it.
Well, so our policies have turned these places into narco states, haven't they?
I wouldn't go that far in Bolivia, but there is a lot more sort of narco state. We could go there with Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, the center of the world, yes. Russell Crandall, we thank you. And if I ask you back one day, I hope that you just don't say no. On the next episode of History as It Happens, listening to Eisenhower.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
His warning is often quoted, but what did he actually mean? How did the United States become what Ike would have called a garrison state? That's next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.